Thank you so much, Glenn. My name is Mary. I am an alcoholic. My sobriety date is April 28th, 1987. And I have a sponsor, and she has a sponsor, and I sponsor a number of other people in this program, a couple of whom are here. I want to thank Rosemary and Barbara for showing up, and my friend Wanda for being here, and definitely my friend Lila. And Glenn, I just want to acknowledge, yes, we have been friends for a very long time. Glenn contacted me when I was chairing the International Women's Conference. I believe the year was actually 1996 when we got in touch with each other because it was the 97 conference, and Glenn came and recorded that conference. And my other dear friend Lila was our Saturday night speaker at that conference. And the connection between the two of them has resulted in the circulation of some recordings on the steps that have helped many, many people. So I just want to acknowledge both of them before I get started here. Um, I'm gonna stick to the kind of traditional format of, telling how it was, what happened, and what it's like today, in the hopes that, some of the things that I say in the how it was portion of my talk will help anyone who is newer. It's been a while since I picked up a drink, but whenever I have the opportunity to tell my story, it's a reminder to me to look back at who I was and what the blessings have been that have been brought into my life by the fellowship and program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I will tell you that I started drinking at a pretty young age. I was about 12 years old when I first started, drinking beer. And my mother was involved in the very first year of the Head Start program. She was a school teacher, and one of the other teachers in the program was somebody that, I really liked, and she allowed me to drink beer at her house. And I don't know that she was an alcoholic. I mean, my memory of her is not that, but it it was kind of an interesting experience because I knew I was doing something wrong. It didn't really have the immediate effect on me at that time. Maybe because I wasn't, really invested in it or whatever. But the very first time that I can remember getting drunk, I was 15 years old, and my father was an alcoholic, and he actually handed me my first drink, a cocktail, a bourbon and soda. I still remember it. It was much tastier to me than the beer was. And I can remember that that was when the effect of alcohol really was noticeable to me. And I was a combination of I liked it, but I was also a little scared by it because it changed me so much. And I was a kid who, because my parents had divorced when I was a pretty young child, was invested in control, self-control, control of my environment. And my mother was a school teacher in a small town in Illinois, so there was a certain kind of code of behavior that I think I was expected to follow. And being the oldest kid, that's pretty much what I did. And things went on. I ended up living with my alcoholic father and his second alcoholic wife during the years of my adolescence. And that was a very troubled time in my life. She, unfortunately, in addition to her alcoholism, suffered from bipolar illness. And so when she drank, she became very violent. And it took me many years to get to a point of being able to let go of that, being able to find some level of forgiveness and tolerance of her for what she had suffered herself. And I'll get to that part of my story in a little bit. But I began drinking with friends when I was 16 years old, and I still distinctly remember the very first time we got together at a party at the girls who lived next door, and we all got drunk. We were drinking vodka in a beverage that was available at the time called Tab, which was produced by Coca-Cola, I think, and it stood for totally artificial beverage. You can't imagine a worse tasting drink, but we just guzzled it down. And, I, I got so drunk that I passed out on the bed with my eyes wide open, and they could not wake me up. And I could hardly wait to do it again. And from there, I went on to sneaking wine into the thermos of my lunch that I took to school. And by that point, I was living in Southern California, so the campus had this kind of big open amphitheater outside where I could sit and eat my lunch and drink my wine and be sort of apart from everybody else and not be, caught at it. Um, at the end of my high school career, I went to a party with some friends, and this is a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, so I'm only going to obliquely refer to dry goods, but there were a lot of dry goods at that party, hallucinogenic dry goods, and I ended up consuming quite a bit of it. And like other alcoholics that I have met along my path, those substances can kind of trigger something in the brain of an alcoholic that might not be triggered in the brain of a person who does not have this X factor that we all share. And I ended up um, pretty damaged by that experience and landed myself in a state hospital in Southern California. It was at a place called the Norwalk State Hospital in Camarillo, California. And it was a terrifying experience. And that was actually the place where I went to my very first 12-step meeting. And that was prior to the days when there was our other fellowship for drug addicts. And so everybody was kind of thrown in together in this facility. And, it was such a frightening experience for me because, they told me, oh, you're just a baby, you don't have any experience with this, and so on and so forth. And it left me with a kind of a chip on my shoulder about the possibility of seeking out help at an earlier age in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that is, that's just me. Someone else might have had a very different response to it, but that was my response. And, I was kind of one of those kids that, don't bother me, I can handle this. I was, very invested in my own self-sufficiency. And so I got out of that situation. A psychiatrist who was treating me contacted my mom, who made arrangements for me to come back to the Midwest, and that is what I did. And my mother was very glad to have me home after 3 years of absence. And, even though I really didn't know what I wanted to do, I was, kind of flattened out by my experiences over the past 3 years internally. And that was really the stage that was set for the complete emptiness that I was in by the time I got to Alcoholics Anonymous in my early 30s. And, but she encouraged me to, start taking some college classes, and I did. And, a couple of years later, I got admitted into a 4-year university in the city of Chicago. And that is where I lived most of my adult life until I was in my mid 40s. So when I was in school, we used to have what they called sherry hours in the dorm, and we would go and drink glasses of sherry with our little pinkies up, And as soon as that was over with, I would get on the commuter train and go up to the north side of Chicago and run amok in the bars there. And that is where my alcoholism really began to take off. And I graduated from college really by the skin of my teeth because it was after the structure of the classes and the drive to get the degree was over with, I was cut loose. I had no further structure in my life. And that is when things began to go south for me. And, I spent a lot of time in bars. I spent a lot of time drinking. I spent a lot of time hungover. I was not the best employee in the world. I lost a good job with a major corporation in downtown Chicago because of my drinking. I was one of those alcoholics that was kind of on that merry-go-round, going in and out of psych wards. I was fortunate that it really wasn't until shortly before I got sober that I ended up in the women's lockup in Chicago at Belmont and Western one night. And that's kind of a long story, but I was basically arrested for parking tickets that had accumulated on my car because a young woman who I had helped out's mafia boyfriend's son had borrowed the car and parked it illegally in multiple places, and therefore the tickets accumulated. And they had a record when they busted me outside of a bar for supposedly alcoholic loitering, and off to jail I went. And I still remember that experience. It was kind of the beginning of a wake-up call for me because they took me down to traffic court the next morning, and there I was, in this cell, and I was brought in before a judge with an Irish last name whose eye color was the same as mine. And I looked up into his face, and he looked down at me, and he did let me go on my own recognizance. And I was very, very grateful for that. And again, I'm not going to go into the details of how those tickets were erased, but they were erased because they were erased off the docket because my sister's boyfriend was a Jack Daniels distributor, and he took a case of Jack Daniels down to get rid of her tickets and mine, and that's how justice is meted out in the city of Chicago. So let me move on here a little bit. The light within me continued to darken. Now, by this time, it's the early 80s. I had a friend that I met at work. We became very good friends, and it still shakes me up when I think about this, but she committed suicide. She was a drug addict and an alcoholic, and she was about 27 years old when she killed herself. And, I went to her wake and I looked down in that casket and I knew that if something didn't happen, I wasn't thinking if I didn't do something, but if something didn't happen, I was going to end up in the very same place. And fast forward a little bit later, um, even though I was very empty inside, I just broken up with a girlfriend of mine, and I knew that I had to do something. And even then, I knew that helping other people was going to make me feel better. And so I volunteered at a drop-in center for homeless and otherwise indigent women in the neighborhood of Uptown in Chicago. And there were many women that came there who were alcoholic, some of them mentally ill, many of them alcoholic. And I still to this day remember those women, and they taught me what my yet was going to be. There was another tap on the shoulder from a power greater than myself as I worked to help them and was the volunteer in the evenings there, like 2 nights a month. So again, fast forward, um, beginning of the summer of 1986. I'm 34 years old, just short of 34 years old. I had been working for the last several years in advertising agencies. My primary job at that time was procuring dry goods for my boss. And because of his addictions and lack of productivity, our whole division was divested. And it was the beginning of the summer. I was out of a job, and my response was, oh, good, I can just collect unemployment and go to the beach every day and drink. And that's exactly what I started to do. And so there I am on the beach, and this was one of several deeply spiritual experiences, the first of which led me into Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm on the beach. It's a place called the Hollywood Beach in the city of Chicago, which is up on the north side. I lived about 4 blocks from that beach. And I'd go there every day and I'd spread out my little blanket and I'd look out at the lake. Lake Michigan looks very oceanic. You can look out and not see anything other than the sky and the water on the horizon. And all of a sudden one day, something woke me up, something being the tap on the shoulder from the higher power. And I sat up and I looked out where the sky met the water and I said in a prayer, I will do whatever you want me to do and I will go wherever you want me to go. But I know if I go any further in the direction I'm going to end up on the streets homeless, like the women at Sarah's Circle. So I gathered up my blanket and the rest of my little things, and I wiped my eyes and I started walking back to my apartment. And on the way home, this was back in the days when you could put a quarter in a vending machine and buy a newspaper. And so I did, and I bought a copy of a newspaper I never bought, the Chicago Sun-Times, because I was a newspaper snob and I thought that that newspaper was beneath me at the time. But I got it home and I opened it up, and inside that paper was an insert on the topic of recovery. And in that insert was an article on a fellowship called Adult Children of Alcoholics. I didn't even know what alcoholism was, except I knew that my father was an excessive drinker. And I knew that I still had a great deal of bitterness towards him, towards everything that he had done to me in the years that I had lived with him. So, unlike me, because again, as I mentioned earlier, self-sufficiency was my gig. I picked up my phone, a wall phone with a punch, the numbers that you could punch, and called the number that was in this article and talked to a woman who was about ready to send me to a place called the 5555 Club, which is out on the northwest side of Chicago. And, I just knew that I was not going to run into my tribe there. So I said, well, don't you have anything closer to like Broadway and Diversey, which is, kind of the gay neighborhood in Chicago? And she said, well, as a matter of fact, we do. And so she sent me down to this Episcopal church, and there was a meeting of that fellowship at 6 o'clock in the evening. And by this point, I had wrecked my car. I was not drunk when I wrecked it, but I was hungover. And got on the number 36 bus and went down there. And we jokingly used to call the number 36 bus a mental ward on wheels because a lot of mentally ill people lived in that area of Chicago. And I got off the bus and I got there early. And I was standing at the door, and there were two people at the door, both of whom happened to be members of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the gentleman, Bill, who later became a very good friend of mine, said to me, well, I just celebrated 2 years of sobriety. And I said, well, that's nice because I had no idea what 2 years of sobriety means in the life of an alcoholic. And so I sat and talked with them for a while. They were very kind to me. I went into the meeting. I was, welcomed. It was a group of people, about half of whom were AA members and maybe half were Al-Anon members. And it was a large group. And within 3 or 4 weeks, the AA members in that group helped me to understand that what I experienced when I drank were symptoms of alcoholism. If I had been told that I had a physical allergy to alcohol and a craving, a mental craving that started once I drank, I don't think I would have known what they were talking about because that was just the water, that was the air I breathed. But what they told me were things like, well, we suffer personality changes when we drink. We have terrible hangovers. There were a couple of other things that they mentioned that helped me to recognize that maybe I had this problem too. And so I called a former girlfriend of mine that I knew had been in and out of the program and asked her if she would take me to a meeting. And she did. She took me to the Tuesday night women's meeting at the Newtown Alano Club. And I, I went into that meeting, and the woman who was the secretary was someone who also later became a very good friend of mine. And she just asked me, because it was a closed meeting, do you have a desire to stop drinking? And do you have a problem with alcohol? Because to attend a closed meeting, we have to have both of those qualities, not just the desire to quit drinking. And I said yes, I did. And I kept going back to that group. I went to one meeting a week for quite some time and thought that that was going to be enough. And eventually, what happened is that the people in the fellowship, they were very kind to me. They surrounded me. They invited me to be part of the Chicago Roundup, which was a conference uh, put on by gay men and lesbians in Chicago. And I got a service position in that conference. I began to make friends. And, one thing led to another. And oh, there's somebody who is typing nasty stuff in the chat. So could that person be thrown out?
We got
I
him.
got him.
Okay. Where was I? So I had the opportunity to begin to um, you know, do some service in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I did, get some sponsors at that time, but the sponsorship in my environment at that time was what I later began to call coffee shop sponsorship. And it was where I would get together with somebody and I would just talk about my problems. And that didn't really help me. It was not until sometime later in the program when I found a sponsor who is my sponsor today, who sat down with me over the course of about a year and a half and took me word for word through the big book and helped me to understand what the steps say, what they mean, how to take those steps inside of myself, and how to begin to live the way of life and the philosophy that Alcoholics Anonymous offers those of us who choose to pick it up. And um, when I had about 10 years of sobriety, I will say that in that those earlier years, I did have one really amazing experience in Alcoholics Anonymous. Kathy W., who was at that time the manager of the Chicago area service office, hired me, and I worked in that office for a couple of years. And it gave me a different kind of view of Alcoholics Anonymous, the bigger picture, if you will. And, I got to eventually be the assistant bookkeeper and, count the money because a lot of groups in those days still brought in envelopes full of cash. And I began to see how the money that we put into the basket helps the entire fellowship. And so there was, I started going to the women's conference in 1990, and Kathy was again the person who told me about it, suggested that I go, and I did. I went up to Minneapolis that year and went and fell absolutely in love with it. And in 1996, there was kind of an emergency situation, and the women who had gotten the bid for Chicago did not seem to be able to bring it forth into fruition. And so they tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Would you step in as chair?" And I did. And it turned out to be an absolutely amazing experience. I want to back up just a little bit because I want to tell you about the second major spiritual experience that I had. The first one was when I was on the beach. The second one was several years after that. And like Dr. Bob describes in his story, Dr. Bob's Nightmare, the craving for alcohol did not leave him right away. And it really didn't leave me either. I was kind of walking around after my pink cloud began to fade and sort of what I think basically was a dry drunk state. And one evening, I was going to go to a concert in downtown Chicago with some friends, and we all gathered in the apartment of one of them who lived in the same building I lived in. And, none of them were alcoholic. They were having their beer, and I was having my Coke or whatever. And I got in the car with them to go downtown to a concert being performed by Bonnie Raitt. And all of a sudden, I the madness was on me. I mean, I all I can remember was just being kind of blinded by it. And I wanted to have a drink. I wanted to get to that concert and I wanted to drink Southern Comfort and pretend I was Janis Joplin and just do all this crazy stuff. And on the way down, I had developed, I think Lila is the person who gave me this expression, enough spiritual muscle by doing my best to work steps one, two, and three that all of a sudden, I was in this prayerful state and I said, God, I am powerless over this. You have restored me to some degree of sanity. Please take this away. And it was lifted and it has never come back. And I got to that concert and there were about six of us in the group and I was sitting on the end and I sat down next to a guy that I didn't know who was just another random person in the audience. And he was drinking Southern Comfort and I could smell it and I didn't want it. And then it turned out that at least that night, while she never identified herself as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bonnie Raitt talked about being sober. And then she sang the song Angel from Montgomery. And it still brings tears to my eyes when I think about it because I don't think there was a dry eye in that whole audience. And I know mine certainly weren't because it's one of those memories that is as clear today as it was then. So the third major spiritual experience that I'm going to describe to you is in connection with that 1997 International Women's Conference. We um, we were in the Marriott Hotel on Michigan Avenue, and we started out with I think about I don't know maybe 1,200 women who were registered, and they just kept coming. And we didn't know whether we were going to, how we were going to handle the large number of women that were registering on site. And it was up to me as the chair to make the decision whether to keep the door open or to close the registration and start turning people away. Now it's February 14th. It's a big major hotel on Michigan Avenue. And that hotel stepped forward and gave us a ballroom that happened to be empty above the ballroom where we were having our Saturday night banquet and where Lila was our speaker. And at no charge, they set up an additional, I think, 800 seats and closed circuit screens and made it possible for us to continue to register. And we had 2,500 women there that night. That's divine intervention in my experience. So, whenever I share these experiences, and I get kind of weepy-eyed when I do, every once in a while, I think we all have doubts. Maybe we're going through something difficult. It's like, okay, where is the higher power? And then when I recall these experiences and I share them with other members of this fellowship, it's a great reminder to me that, there is a higher power. It is real. And so, shortly after that conference, I left Chicago for 5 years. I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, and um, you know, it's like this woman in Chicago who used to conduct a meeting at the Mustard Seed used to say, everything in life is connected to finance or romance. And, you stop to think about it, and she had quite a good point. Well, it was romance that took me to the Bay Area. And, but what took me there ended up opening my eyes to so much. I had many, many experiences there that had really positive effects on my sobriety. And even though the relationship didn't work out, that person and I are still good friends today. We don't see each other very often because there's a lot of geography between us, but the friendship is there. And that is the principle of the program in action. I came back to Chicago in 2002, and there was just a lot of stuff that I've left out of this story. In my sobriety, I went back to school. I got a profession. I worked in that profession for almost 30 years. I could not have done it without being sober. I could not have done it without my home group. I'd go into my home group every Friday night and complain about how all I was doing was going to class and eating and sleeping. And they just kept saying to me, "You can do this. You can do this." And their encouragement was so important to me, which, we talk about the spiritual work that we do in Alcoholics Anonymous, which is very, very important. Getting a sponsor, having someone who is a little bit ahead of us on the road to help us understand the steps, help us to find a higher power is really important. But, there's the God with skin too, which is the other members of the fellowship, and the friendships that we develop. And over the last couple of years, I've gone through some kind of hard times. I moved out here to Des Moines, Iowa from Chicago for multiple reasons, but the primary one was to be able to better care for my mother, who was in the last years of her life. And my mom died 10 years ago. And right about that same time, a woman who had become a very good friend of mine here in Des Moines began to slide, downhill in terms of her health. And, I became her caregiver, her power of attorney, her medical power of attorney. And, Alcoholics Anonymous teaches us to practice the principles in all of our affairs, and not just in the rooms of AA. And I had learned by that point in my sobriety to be of service and to do it willingly. And I'm gonna share a little story with you about this situation because Marge was a kind of a loner, and she was a neighbor that I got to know. And because of a variety of reasons, she didn't have a very much of a social life. And there's an open AA meeting weekly, just half a block away from where we lived. And I used to take her to that meeting with me. So she kind of began to be familiar with some things about AA. And one day, as her power of attorney, her bank accounts were connected to mine. And she said to me, "Would you take me over to the ATM machine? I need to check my balance." And I said, "Well, we don't have to do that. I'll show you." And so I opened up my phone app and showed her what her balance was. And she looked at me and she said, "You could really rip me off." And I said, "Well, I would never do that." And I don't know, maybe a month or two later, she wanted to move some money from her savings account to her checking account and asked me if I would take her over to the bank to do that. And again, I said, "Oh, we don't need to do that." Here, and I showed her, her accounts on my phone and said, "How much do you want to transfer?" And I transferred it. And again, she said, "You could really rip me off." And I said, "Well, Marge, the truth is, yes, I really could rip you off, but here's why I never will rip you off. My AA program requires me to be rigorously honest. If I ripped you off, I would violate that primary baseline principle and I would put myself at risk to drink. And if I drink, I will die. And that is why I will never rip you off." And she never ever doubted me again. It was just one of those amazing moments where the practicalities of sobriety could be visible to a person who depended on me, but who didn't really know what the inner workings of our steps are. And Marge died 2 years ago this month. And she had a relatively large estate, and I'm still in the process of settling it. And I have a friend here in this meeting who was very instrumental in guiding me through some of that, and I want to acknowledge that and thank her for that. And it's all worked out in ways that I never dreamed that it would. And years ago, I got a kind of an online ministerial credential, mostly because I was conducting workshops on a spiritual topic, and not AA, it was something else. And the money that I charged people could then not be taxed because I was a minister. So I was also credentialed in order to conduct funerals, and I was able to conduct Marge's memorial service. And that was a really touching and beautiful experience, to help her before she died to plan what she wanted. And again, to be of service in a way that I was taught to be in Alcoholics Anonymous. And so, you know, that's really what it's like today. I am now 72 years old. I do not have the energy or the physical ability to do what I once did in AA, but I still love to sponsor people. When I moved here to Des Moines, I my service niche in AA has primarily been with women. And there was not a closed women's AA meeting in Des Moines when I moved here in 2010. So a year later, I started one, and it's now my home group. And it's a group called Big Book Babes. And I borrowed the name from one group in Chicago and the format from my old home group. And we started with 4 or 5 women, and today there are over 100 women that come every morning, every Saturday morning, to not just read the big book, but to connect with one another. They find sponsors there. We have lots of newcomers that come. And it's just been an amazing experience. Every Saturday morning when I go to that group, I just think if there was ever any doubt in my mind about why I got swept away from Chicago and out here to Des Moines, Iowa, here's the answer. And, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I got a group of women together and we started a women's luncheon, a yearly women's luncheon. We have the Al-Anons participate. So we have an Al-Anon speaker and an AA speaker. And, we had like 140 women at the event last weekend. And, that is also something I could step away. I didn't have to be a bleeding deacon. These younger women have stepped in, they've done it. I'm very proud of them. I can just be one among many now in that. But I can go to my grave once I get there knowing that because of skills that I was given in my life, I've been able to share those skills in ways that have helped other people in this fellowship. And, I'm really grateful for that because that service keeps me sober too. And, when the pandemic hit, my profession had given me the opportunity to learn how to use Zoom. And all of a sudden, I knew an awful lot of people who had no clue about how to use this technology to join meetings. And so I was able to, again, share, AA had given me the ability to have a profession. And that profession had then turned around and given me the ability to turn around and offer this help to people in AA, especially my older friends, people in my age group and older who just didn't know how to do it. And I've been able to serve many times as a co-host in these meetings and keep the Zoom bombers out, so on and so forth. So, which again, gives me an opportunity to enjoy my control freak nature. So, but I think I think that that's really, I'm going to wrap it up here. It's getting, close to the hour here, but I I'm very grateful for the sponsor that I have today. She's sober since 1981. She was my sponsor 20 years ago, and then there was an interlude where I was sponsored by someone else, and then I came back to her. She lives in Chicago. She's very much a part of my old home group there. I call her once a week, and I communicate with her in between those times as needed. And she and her other sponsees meet together on Friday nights. I meet with my sponsees on Wednesday nights on Zoom because I have sponsees that are scattered all over the country, and I'm grateful that we have this technology that enables us to meet on a regular basis. And I just sometimes I struggle with stuff. It's like I don't think there's anybody in the fellowship that's been in it for a while that sometimes doesn't think, well, what's next? Or is this all there is? Or whatever. And there's a pamphlet that addresses that very issue that is one of my favorite pieces of AA literature called A Member's Eye View of Alcoholics Anonymous. And if you have never read it, I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful piece of writing and insight, especially for those of us with a little bit more time. But one of the things that I have been doing recently is that at my ripe old age of 72, I decided to go back to school. Now, it's not a degree program because God knows I have no need for any further degrees at this point. But I entered a program that's based on the great books. And what has been amazing to me is that as I have read these ancient philosophers, it strikes me that the nature of Bill Wilson's education likely included this. He went to, a boarding school in Vermont at the turn of the century, and I'm sure that those kids were required to read Latin and Greek. And, you know, reading some of the stuff that I have been reading, namely Plato and Aristotle, has really struck me about how much Bill might have known because there is so much of it in his writing. And it just has been an amazing experience to me to go back into this kind of class online, again, thanks to Zoom, um, and read this material, discuss it with other people, and recognize not only that it may have fertilized Bill's thinking, but that the years I've spent in Alcoholics Anonymous have given me a clarity of mind that I can read these sometimes difficult pieces and have a greater insight into them. I know that human nature is capable of great change. I'm not sure that people outside of our program know that to the depth that we know it, because each and every one of us in sobriety has been given the opportunity for a second chance at life. Most of us did not come into Alcoholics Anonymous thinking, oh, I think I'll just go to AA today. We came in pretty close to death, many of us, and if not close to death, on our way to it. And this program, it's just amazing what it does for us. And each one of the 12 steps, you know, involves an aspect of our development as complete human beings again. That we admit we're powerless, we begin to be restored to sanity, we make a decision that we can't be self-sufficient. We have to turn our lives over to something greater than ourselves. We do an inventory. We share that inventory with another human being and with our higher power. And then we get to step 6 and 7, the transformational steps, where we've been able to recognize that we have these flaws in our character, and we begin to learn how to transform those flaws into virtues. And then once that process sets in, then we can truly go to the people we have harmed and we can make true amends because we are changed inside. We aren't the same people that we were when we harmed them. And then we get to go on with our, examined life. And as Socrates told us, an unexamined life isn't worth living. And that's exactly what step 10 does for us. It gives us the chance to examine our lives. We get a chance to deepen our relationship with a higher power, whether it's the great reality deep within or whether we have a religious practice, it doesn't really matter because AA isn't religion. It's a philosophy of life. It's a spiritual program. And then in step 12, we get to go out and practice these principles. And we get to try to carry the message to other alcoholics. How beautiful is that? And then once we get to that point, then we start learning about the traditions. And I've often said that the traditions are Al-Anon for alcoholics, teaches us how to get along with other people, both in and out of the rooms. And then, if we are still curious, we can learn about the 12 concepts, which are beautiful principles in and of themselves as well. And to learn about the beauty and the complexity of the way that our fellowship is set up at the service level is quite incredible. And I'm still learning about that and still curious about that, and have friends who have served at the bottom of our inverted triangle who are willing to share what they know about that. So all of it, it's one big, beautiful package. And each and every alcoholic on this planet, it's my wish that we would all find it. Not all of us do. Those of us who are here are the lucky ones. And so I'm going to turn it back over at this point to Glenn. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here and listening to me. I would have felt pretty foolish if I'd been in this room by myself trying to tell this story. So thank you all for being a part of my sobriety. And with that, I will close.